Our next speaker is Christine. Christine is also a clinical psychologist, and she is very passionate about working with the pediatric population. Christine conducts psychotherapy and clinical assessments to children and adolescents with mood and anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorders, school refusal, and neurodevelopmental disorders. So examples would be ADHD and autism. And today, Christine will be sharing with us on a very tricky topic, about how to talk to our children about the birds and the bees. Over to you, Christine.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for spending this morning with me. So unlike the description, today we'll be talking about something very different. So I'll be talking about the birds and the bees. So I would like to invite everyone to just use the chat group, the chat function, to type in what's one word that comes to your mind when you hear the phrase bird and the bee. What's the first word that comes to your mind? Yeah, thank you, Nicole. Yes, reproduction. Anyone else? So yes, earlier, someone shared that birds and the bees is about sexual reproduction. So I'll move on to that. It's really the dreaded talk about sex, with our children. So let me move on to share with you why is it important to talk about it. All right, so why is it important to talk to children about sex? It's actually a very essential part of parenting if you think about it. So because we are the first role models, as we set the necessary boundaries, because through the talk about sex, we can also impart our family values. And through that, we actually strengthen the parent-child bond. And when we talk about sex with our children, we also provide a very comprehensive sexuality education to them. As we know that sometimes nowadays, they have a lot of exposure to social media, and sometimes inaccurate information can actually be exposed to our children at a very young age. So when we have a conversation with them, we might be able to provide a more comprehensive sexuality education. Studies have also shown that it empowers our children to make healthier sexual decisions. So a recent study in 2018 showed that actually, when you speak to your youth about sexual matters, they actually have better sexual health knowledge. Okay, so some common reactions about the topic. So in 2020, and I want to let you know that you're not alone, because in 2020, a survey was conducted and more than 500 respondents were involved, and 43% of parents actually shared that they were uncomfortable discussing about sexual health with their children. So most of them were embarrassed by the sensitivity and intimacy of the topic. They were uncertain about how to start the conversation. And they also lack the confidence because they lack the appropriate tools to begin the conversation, and they're also afraid of not knowing the answers. And so I just wanted to let you know, if you're uncomfortable about this topic, you're not alone. So let me share with you a very personal example. So I have a 4-year-old, and recently she just caught me off guard, and she asked a question like, how come mommy and daddy can change in the same room? And I didn't have the answer immediately. So I told her I'll get back to her, because it's a lot of layers to that question. It's not just about, the gender differences, not just about marriage, it's also about consent, and there's just a lot of layers. So I will share with you how you can prepare for questions like that. Okay, so we'll go on to how you can prepare for the conversation. So the very, very first thing I think is really important to everyone, right, is to reflect on your values. So you need to consider your own personal values, taking religion into perspective, your own personal experiences, and think about what your stance is on sex-related issues. So some of these topics you can think about is premarital sex. What are your take on that? Are you supportive or not? Also about masturbation. Is this something that you are supportive, or are you against it? When and how can your child date? So the boundaries in dating, as well as sexual orientation. So you can take a minute to think about your values while you prepare your conversation with your children. Okay. when you are thinking about your values, it's always really important to think about your spouse or your partner. Yeah, so because it's really important to reach a consensus. Both of you need to be on the same page when you have conversations about sex with your children. Yeah. You will also need to be prepared that your child will determine how the conversations look like. They will usually take the lead and they will ask a lot of questions. So you need to be prepared for that as well. And most importantly, I think you also need to know what's being taught in school. So in our local context, in Ministry of Education, in our Ministry of Education, their take is that they promote abstinence before marriage. So you need to think about how, if you are not promoting that, then you need to have this conversation with your children as well. Okay. So how you can ease the discomfort. If you think about it, it's like any other conversation that you would have with your children. So acknowledge any discomfort that you have. So, and if you're a parent of a young child right now, yeah, starting early is always a very good place to start, because we do not only want to bring up an awkward topic at an awkward age. So usually teenagers are usually an awkward age, and this is a very uncomfortable topic. Yeah. So look out for teachable moments. So for example, we see movie scenes, couples outside, or you can even bring up hypothetical scenarios or current affairs. So for example, the recent repeal of 377A, this is something that you can share, you can talk about with your teenagers, because then you can also from there observe how your child would respond to such topics and how they understand their values as well as their views on sex. Okay. And of course, it doesn't need to be face-to-face all the time. So you can have a conversation while you're on a car ride, or maybe when you're jogging or exercising with your teens or your children. You can also consider leaving them notes. Yeah. Okay. Of course, another thing that you need to do is to make sense of your confusion, because honestly, this is something really, really new to me as well. I'm not really clear about this. So I always do my readings on this. So sexual orientation, of course, to be aware of your values when it comes to this. Not everyone has the same values when we talk about sexual orientation. Yeah, you can also acknowledge all your emotions, all your discomfort and your emotions. Whether it's uncomfortable for you, you can always bring this up to your children as well. Yeah, most importantly, enhance your knowledge on this topic. And I'll share with you some books later that you can refer to as well. So there are support groups as well. So parent support groups that you can join with regards to this, if let's say you need some advice. So this is something that you can seek as well. And just now earlier, I mentioned that there are books to aid the conversation. So these are just two titles that you can think about exploring if you want to have this conversation with your children. Okay, so how can you support your child who is trying to explore their sexual orientation? Most importantly is really not asking what their sexual orientation is, but to allow them to explore their thoughts and feelings about relationships. And of course, explicitly letting your child know that even if you or they are confused about their sexual orientation, you are there for them, that you love them, that you accept them, and you will stand by them. And of course, it's really important to remain calm. I know as parents, it's quite difficult to remain calm during conversations, but this is something that is really important, because we want to create a safe space for them when you have a conversation like that, because it can be a very sensitive topic that will involve a lot of emotions and thoughts. So most important thing is to remain calm, and also to refrain from casting judgment and overreacting. So always listen to what they are experiencing and feeling behind the questions that they are asking. So how can you talk about it? So if you think about starting the conversation early, so if you are thinking about preschoolers, so what you can do is to identify body parts with them with the proper terms. So not wee, bird, cuckoo bird. Use the proper terms like vagina, penis, and things like that. So you need to start the conversation early so that you build a good space for them from a very young age. Also, if you think about preschoolers, you can actually start talking about good touch versus bad touch already, but in a very simple terms. So for example, a good touch can be something that makes you feel that you're being helped, versus bad touch, which is something that makes you feel confused or scared. So this is a very, very, very simple definition for good touch versus bad touch, which you can develop when they grow older. Okay, and then when it comes to consent, you can actually start practicing consent with your preschoolers at a very young age by asking your child permission before you help them clean up, because you will be touching their private parts as well. So this is how you can actually model what consent is like at a young age. Okay. Privacy. So this is something that, we also learn in school, gendered toilets, you need to lock your doors. This is something that you can also practice at home. So for my family, we have this consensus that my husband cannot shower my children, my girls, because I have 2 girls. So this is something that I have adopted. So it's easier to also differentiate between privacy. So this is really, at the end of the day, it's really up to you what your family values are. Okay, you can also start introducing concepts such as physical affection, family, and love. Okay, and answer where did I come from. So this is so you can look at books. So at a very young age, with the preschoolers, you can use books. So these are 3 titles that you can look at. It's not the stock. So that's How I Was Born and Mommy Laid and Ate. So these are some things that you can look at. Okay, so when you go on to primary school years, you can start talking about puberty, so body changes. So for example, growing breasts, voice changes. So these are some topics that you can start off in the earlier primary school years. And as they grow older, right, you can actually also start talking about menstruation. So if you bear in mind, use the proper words, so menstruation, erection, things like that. Even things about wet dreams. Yeah, so I understood from my husband that this is something that wasn't taught to him before, and he was really shocked when it happened to him. So things like that would be a good thing to teach your children so that they are not caught off guard as well. Okay, and then move on to talk about more about good touch versus bad touch, like who can touch. So talking about boundaries as well with different people. And more about consent. So at this point, they would be able to tell people yes and no. So this is where you can be more explicit. And of course, there are also books to aid the conversation so that it's not so difficult for you if, let's say, you don't know what to talk about. There are books that can guide you as well. So there are 2 titles that I have shared in this slide that you can take note of. Yeah, and also to take note of what to do when others challenge or cross their boundaries. So as we know nowadays in public transports, we are always really close to each other. So it's how they can also say no and how to differentiate when people are intentionally or unintentionally touching them. Okay, so at primary school years, you can also start discussing about the biological process of sexual intercourse. Yeah, so this is something that you can have a conversation. It can be very scientific in nature. So you can actually take tips from science. So they do start actually quite an early age. They do introduce, sperms and eggs, and this is where you can actually already start talking about the biological process. Yeah, and also talk about what is a good friend. And when you're talking about what is a good friend, you can actually have a very good discussion about healthy relationships. So what is healthy and what is not. So this is a good start in the primary school years to talk about something like that. Okay. So other books. So as I go along, I will introduce a lot of books that you can also refer to. Yeah. So this is another book that you can use to aid your conversation, and that's Let's Talk About the Birds and the Bees. And this is quite useful for the primary schoolers. So when we go on to the secondary school years, sex education will come into play a lot more in their secondary schools as well. So in our local context, and even in the international schools, they do have sexuality education. So they will touch a little bit about how to use contraceptives. But I know in our local context, because they practice abstinence, so that's why they may not introduce contraceptives. So this is something that you might have to think about if this is something that is in your family values. So if you have different values from what the school is teaching, so this is something that you can take in mind as well. So what is safe sex? What is consent? and saying no, because actually sometimes saying no can be a little bit tricky. So some people might actually be pressured into saying no. So having a very open conversation about that is also very important. Yeah. Also talking about pornography. So there is this interesting fact that I just recently found out, that it's not illegal to stream pornography. Yeah, so this is something that you might have to be aware of as well. So streaming is not illegal, but holding pornography is. So this is something that I recently found out as well. So this is something that you can actually also Google, and it's one of our law. Yeah. Also talk about sexual expression, because this is the time in the secondary school years. This is where they're trying to identify who they are. And this is where the sexual orientation will come in quite a bit. Okay. And when you're talking to them, it's also, this is where you can start sharing about your own values as well. You can also talk about differentiating, respectful, healthy relationships versus abusive and unhealthy relationships as well. Okay, so for you, you can start sharing a lot more about their own values and religion, because they're at an age where they will understand a lot more of an abstract concepts. So this, you can bring this more into play now. Yeah, so you can talk about, what you think and what you feel about certain matters, and also to take, culture, society, and law when you have conversations about this with your teens. So there are two titles that you can refer to if, let's say, you're having a conversation about sexual orientation. So these are the two titles. It's Perfectly Normal and The Everybody Book. It's an LGBT inclusive book that you can refer to if you're interested. Okay. So what I'm going to show you next is a video that I came across, which will lead me to some of the key principles that will be very important when you're having conversations with your children. So not just about sex, but everything in general. So I'm going to move on to share with you a video. It's called What's Virgin Mean?
Spinach, 3 eggs, 2 large aubergines, 6 small courgettes, and fontina cheese.
Mummy?
Yes, darling.
What's virgin mean?
Sorry, darling?
What does virgin mean?
Girls and boys, grown-ups, bodies are different, but they're made to fit together in a very clever way, like a jigsaw.
Like the jigsaw's grandpa does?
Yes. No. When a mummy and a daddy love each other a lot, then sometimes they like to show each other just how much they love each other.
Does Daddy give Mummy a present?
Sort of.
What kind of presents?
Daddy has a special thing, and so has Mummy. And when Mummy and Daddy want to make something very special, to make a baby, then Daddy takes his special thing and puts it in Mummy's special place.
Winchester?
No.
The shoe shop?
No, darling. A special place on Mummy's body. And that makes Mummy feel very happy. Makes Daddy feel happy as well. And eventually, after a while, sometimes quite quickly, Daddy gets so happy, there's a sort of whoosh and an explosion, and all Daddy's little seeds shoot out and race to get to Mummy's egg. And that's called making love. Anyway, until you do it for the first time, you're, well, a virgin. I think that just about covers it.
So, what's extra virgin mean?
Thank you I hope you enjoyed that little clip. Just want to share. So this will bring me to my next point about key principles when you have conversation with your children. So from that video, I think what's really, really important to take note is that when you're having a conversation with your child, it's really important not to jump to conclusions. And then practice active listening instead, because sometimes really they might not be asking what you think they're asking. So active listening is something really, really important to address their concerns. And while you're doing that is to adopt a non-judgmental stance when they're having conversations with you. Okay. Also to keep an open mind. I think this is something that I think as parents, we find it quite difficult. And we have conversations with our children because we already have a really fixed set of rules and values that we want to follow. But when we are having, especially when we have conversation with our teens, an open mind is something that they really value. Yeah. Also to be open and honest about your own emotions. So you can acknowledge that you do not always have the answers, but you will be available to journey with them. Because you might, like for example, from my own experience, you will be thrown off guard by your children, by the questions that they ask. They can ask the most difficult questions, and if you don't have the answers, that's okay. And you can always tell them that you can come back to them with the answers and open a conversation later on. Okay. So offering a safe space is something else that you need to think about for your children when they turn to you if they're unsure. So you need to let them take the lead sometimes when they're having difficult conversations. So invite questions, but let them come to you when they feel ready. Because sometimes maybe they can ask a question and then they might feel that uncomfortable in the middle. And that's when you can tell them that it's okay to stop and you can carry on the conversation later. Yeah. Try to keep it simple. So for example, in the video, the girl is really, really young. So what mommy tried to tell her is something that might be quite complex for her. So think about, the age of your child when you're having conversations with them, because sometimes concepts, the more abstract concepts can be something that they might not be able to grasp at a different age. So think about that as well. And if you can think that, this conversation about sex, that's not a big conversation that you need to have at one time. So it's not one giant conversation, but think about it as small and frequent bites instead. So then it will be less scary for everyone. So you can keep that in mind. So earlier on, I mentioned that starting early will be a good tip if you have young children. So you can start off then, so that as you go on, this will be an open conversation with them as they grow older, and they won't feel uncomfortable talking about things like that. So other things that you can think about is to be creative. Books is just one way that I've shared multiple times. You can also think about how you can make conversations less awkward. So really look at the teachable moments when you travel, when you go out with them. So it's to be really creative. And sometimes you can also have conversations with your friends about how they also how they have conversations about sex with their own children. Yeah. And share your experiences if they are appropriate and if you're comfortable about it. So earlier on, I shared that, that you might have to have a conversation with your boys, for example, about wet dreams, or if you're older and you're comfortable sharing with a teenager when you lost your virginity. So these are some topics that might actually be a little bit touchy, but it might actually be quite valuable for your teens. So let me share with you that the research has shown that even though you talk about things like that, it doesn't mean that they would be more curious about it. In fact, research has shown that they're actually less likely to engage in unhealthy sexual practices if you have open conversations about this. Yeah. Right. So I've actually come to the end of my sharing. So now we'll open the floor to questions. So I'm open to take any questions that you have. Please feel free to use the chat function as well again.
Okay. Hi, Christine. I think while waiting for the questions to come in, perhaps I could ask if you have any advice on what we should do if your child doesn't want to talk about sex. Sometimes they could be like, "Oh, Mama, I don't want," or like, "So embarrassing." Yeah. So in the event that you face a situation like that, what would you do?
Okay. The most importantly is to value connection more than correction. I think that's a very good point, a very good thing to think about. So if your child becomes uncomfortable, think about how you can build the connection with them first. Okay, so for example, check in on what's going on in their world. So you need to be able to identify with them first, talk about, what they do for entertainment and hobbies. So that's a good start. So valuing the connect, so do connect with them first. Yeah, and then later on, think about how you can connect with them through conversations, because you don't need to have the last say all the time. I am guilty of that. I think when I speak to my children, sometimes I want to have the last say, but that is something that will be tricky, because none of us actually like having conversations with people who have to prove that they are right. So look at connection, but of course, if you disagree, right, with what they're saying, explain your opinion without disrespecting their own views as well. Yeah, so you can say something like, I hear what you said, and this is what I think, and because of this is what I think, and we can keep discussing this to help each other understand our opinions more. Yeah, of course, if you're engaging in something that is unhealthy, then that's when you have to put a stand, because that's a boundary. So yeah. I think we have a question from Nicole. Where can I get the books like Birds and the Bees? You can actually just go on to Amazon. Amazon you can find those there. Book this depository. Yeah, depository. Yeah, that's where also you can find books like Birds and the Bees.
I think also possible for NLB to have some. Also, if you want local options, they should be available at Kinokuniya as well. Yeah. We have another question on what should we do if we don't know the answer to whatever question your child is asking.
Yeah. So if you don't know the answers, like I mentioned earlier, it's okay. So you can acknowledge that you don't have the answers. Like we might not have answers to a lot of questions that our children have for us. So acknowledge, and then you can let them know that you can get back to them when you're ready with the answers. So honesty and being open with your own thoughts and your views are really important when you have conversations with your children.
All right.
Okay.
Yes.
If you have any other questions, you can feel free to just drop it in the chat. Yeah. Otherwise, we will end here and we will prepare for our next speaker. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for sharing this 45 minutes with me.
Thank you, Christine, for taking some time out of your very busy schedule this weekend to join us and to share with us some very important and I think very valuable insights on this topic. Yeah, so hopefully from this we can learn how to better talk to our children about this topic. Yeah. All right, I think we have some time before our next speaker will start at about 12 p.m. So I think this would be a good time for everyone to take a break, get a drink, or maybe get a bit of food to eat, almost lunchtime. All right. Okay. We will see you all back in a couple of minutes. And if you have any queries in the meantime, feel free to let us know.